LinkedIn's economic graph is a digital representation of the global economy. As members change jobs, as companies evolve, as positions are posted, as skills are learned, the economic graph grows. And now we're helping those members, taking what they're adding to the graph and creating new opportunities with those insights. From business owners, to company builders, to culture creators, to policymakers, students, and strivers. The global LinkedIn community is contributing to the economic graph, bringing people and communities together to create opportunities for others, one member at a time.
As you can see from the video, we couldn't be more excited and inspired to build out this economic graph at LinkedIn. Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Nicole Isaac, and I manage US Public Policy at LinkedIn. I'm also a part of the economic graph team, and we're excited to share insights in our research with you today. LinkedIn's vision is to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce, all 3 billion individuals. Now, why does that matter? It matters because in a time of changing future of work, which is impacted by AI, automation, widening skills gaps, as well as the rise of the independent worker, it is ever more critical that we identify ways in which we can work together, everyone in this room, to resolve these challenges. We at LinkedIn are committed to working with employers, partners, government, policymakers, all of the educational institutions, training programs to resolve this future of work and to ensure that we're steps ahead. Now, LinkedIn started as a place where an individual could post their professional profile. This should look familiar because hopefully many of you in the room have a profile that looks just like this. Whether it's Ryan at MCC or my friend Dave at the National League of Cities or Dennis at the Markle Foundation, we're excited about all of the profiles on LinkedIn and the ways in which these profiles are helping to map our global workforce. Today, we know that our members are not only navigating their careers and sharing advice, but they're finding jobs. They're accessing mentors. We have over 1 million individuals on the platform who volunteered to be mentors. And they're sharing professional content. All of these actions together are building our economic graph, a digital representation of the global economy. Today, the economic graph is comprised of 546 million members around the world, over 20 million companies, almost 14 million open jobs that we can see today, over almost 30,000 institutions of higher education, and 120 billion posts and content. And as our community grows, our economic graph grows. Our vision is to ensure that we have a profile for every employer on the platform, such that when there's an open job, any individual at any location, whether in Detroit or Bangalore or in Cote d'Ivoire or in Cape Town, can understand what are the skills needed for that open job. And to the extent that that individual is not prepared for that job today, we would have a profile for every educational institution on the platform. And that individual can access those skills needed for that job tomorrow. We are incredibly excited about the work that we're doing at LinkedIn through our economic graph partnerships. And whether it's building tech talent pipelines in New York or Los Angeles, mitigating youth unemployment in Toronto, partnering with the National League of Cities all across the United States, working with the World Bank in developing countries such as all across sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Europe, and our work with the Markle Foundation. So with that, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Jacqueline Barrett, who will provide more information about our latest research that we're unveiling today. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Hi, everyone. I'm an economist on the economic graph team, and I'm excited to share some of our latest work with you. Our theme today is quantifying skills gaps, and that's exactly what I'm here to talk about. Many employers say they cannot find people with the skills they need, even for entry-level jobs. Skills gaps are an impediment to workers getting jobs and to companies gaining essential talents. Everyone talks about skills gaps, but we have very little insight into how skills gaps present themselves and manifest themselves among and within organizations, states, and regions. We have data on 50,000 unique skills. These are the skills that members add to their profiles. We track the supply and demand of skills, the supply of members with them, and the demand from employers who need them. One of the advantages of our data is that it allows us to see trends unfold in near real time. When new skills emerge, or when demand for a certain skill suddenly spikes, we can quickly identify them. This data set is incredibly dynamic, and we are continuously uncovering new ways to leverage it to understand complex labor market phenomena. Government sources of data on the workforce are some of the best available, but even those have limitations. Because much of the data is collected via survey and curated manually, the rate of change in the workforce can outpace the availability of workforce data and insights. That's why we're excited about the potential for our data to help fill in some of those gaps as a complementary source. In our monthly workforce report, we were able to already highlight changes to the hiring rate nationally, as well as with city and industry granularity. Additionally, our migration insights allow us to uncover dynamics in the labor market with more detail and before anyone else can. As an example, we see that Chicago is serving as a regional talent hub, which attracts workers from nearby college towns, while it is drawing away talent to the coastal cities. So skills gaps. Our definition of a skills gap is a gap between supply and demand for a specific skill in a specific local labor market at a specific point in time. It may be positive, which is the shortage, or negative, which is a surplus. At LinkedIn, our granular skills data make it abundantly clear that there is not one skills gap. Rather, there are many skills gaps, plural. We are now at the point where we can measure skills gaps very precisely in a specific geographic location, for specific skills, over specific periods of time, in absolute headcount numbers. We measure the supply of skills as the number of LinkedIn members who have a particular skill on their profile in a given location. And we measure employer demand for skills by a combination of the skills employers list in their job postings, as well as the skills that they actually hire for. Not based on survey data or job descriptions alone, but on the skills people actually have and the skills that employers are actually hiring for. The skills gaps that we're measuring correspond with exactly what you'd expect to see with unemployment data. Cities and time periods that tend to have more skill shortages also tend to have lower unemployment rates because those skills are in demand. This allows us to look at macroeconomic trends affecting the whole country, as well as local micro trends specific to a single city or a specific industry. Our hope is that together, this micro and macro perspective into skills gaps will prove to be valuable for the policy community as well as others who are trying to close gaps. It provides more transparency into what the actual needs are so that we as a community can go about addressing them more efficiently. If you run a school or are trying to direct funding to a new training program, it can help you know what skills are actually in demand in your local markets. Or if you're struggling to find a job and find that your skills are overly abundant in your city, you can see which cities do have high demand for your skills and consider relocation for better opportunities. Let's look at the big picture, at the gaps that we have as a nation. Oftentimes, when people talk about the skills gap, they're referring to a national need for more graduates with STEM skills. We were curious to see what our numbers showed for skills like software development and mathematics. We track skills gaps in the 100 biggest US cities, and in every single city that we track, communication skills are the #1 skill in scarcity. Across these 100 cities alone, the total shortage is 1.42 million people. That's significantly larger than, say, the national shortage for software development skills, which is around 472,000 people. When we're talking about communication skills as a grouping, we're talking about specific soft skills such as communication, reasoning, and working in teams. Employers are asking for these skills and are hiring people with these skills, yet are unfortunately not able to find enough people who have these arguably fundamental skills. The biggest shortages for soft skills in terms of headcount are in the biggest cities, which isn't surprising. DC alone is short of 59,000 people with communication skills. So here's why this matters. As technology transforms the economy, many individuals will need to not just learn, but relearn new skills in order to remain competitive and employed. And that means that soft skills are only growing in importance. Soft skills are durable and relevant to many different professional environments, and are ultimately the cross-functional skills that enable people to succeed as the world of work evolves. Skills like critical thinking, communication, and problem solving, these are the skills that are worth acquiring. They can't be automated. And they're in demand across all industries, across all levels. This is a nationwide macroeconomic issue. Let's zoom in and take a look at some of the local issues, the microeconomic challenges. The exciting thing about our skills gap analytics is that we can take a macro trend and examine how it's manifesting itself at the local level. Digital literacy is another important foundational skill that it's important for everyone to have as we move into the future of work. Digital skills like knowing how to send an effective email or make a presentation that gets its message across. Interestingly enough, professionals with these skills are distributed across the US, but they're still in high demand in cities deemed to be on the cutting edge of today's economy, such as Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and New York, all of which are facing large shortages of professionals with these skills. However, our data also shows that there are many major cities with intense surpluses, like Detroit, Miami, and Atlanta, meaning professionals may want to relocate to cities where their skills are needed. Another trend that's important to look at on the microeconomic level is discrepancies within specific professions, like teaching, for example. Most people think of the US as having a large shortage of teachers, which is true in many of the largest US cities. Markets like San Francisco, Seattle, and Boston are, for example, grappling with massive shortages of thousands of teachers. The factors that might be driving shortages in these cities include well-documented challenges like unaffordable housing prices and competitive job markets. But in other cities, demographics and population growth are pushing that supply-demand calculus in the opposite direction. Even with these surpluses, these cities can still have a hard time hiring teachers, though, often due to skills mismatches in other areas of expertise. For example, a city may have too many elementary school teachers and not enough high school science teachers. Identifying these nuanced skills gaps on a local level is the next step to understanding the many dynamics influencing hiring markets for teachers. Regardless of the skill in question, skills gaps can be narrowed in a variety of ways. By training people to learn the skills that are in demand from employers, by people moving to cities where their skills are in demand, by businesses opening up shop in cities where there's an abundance of the skills that they need, and by employers offering higher pay for in-demand skills. In order to narrow skills gaps, cities should seek to understand the dynamics of their own labor markets and create policies to align education and training with employer needs. That's why we think this work matters, and that's our hope in sharing this today. Our goal is that quantifying skills gaps at both a macroeconomic and a microeconomic level can help policymakers, employers, teachers, and workers understand the dynamics that they're operating in. We're just getting started, and we'll have lots more to share here in the coming months. If you're interested in working with us, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you. With that, I'd like to welcome Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is the president and CEO of New America, a think and action tank dedicated to renewing America in the digital age, and Jeff Weiner, who is the CEO of LinkedIn. Under his leadership, LinkedIn has expanded our global platform to 24 languages and more than 30 offices around the world, as well as grown our membership base from 33 million to more than 546 million members around the world. Please welcome Anne-Marie Slaughter and Jeff Weiner. Thank you.
Great job. Well done.
We have lots to talk about. We're going to have a conversation for about 40 minutes and then open it up to all of you for your questions. So, Jeff, I have to start by saying I thought I knew LinkedIn pretty well, both as a person and as an employer. But I didn't actually know about the economic graph. I think of LinkedIn as a place, where individuals get jobs, and I think of it as a network of relationships and a platform for a network of relationships. But you're transforming that network into a graph, into as we just heard, a digital representation of the economy. How do you think about those sort of two things coming together, the part of LinkedIn that everybody knows, and this is really quite different?
So they'll ultimately converge and they'll be reconciled. Let me take a step back, by the way. Thank you all for being here. This is the first time we've done an event like this in DC, and very appreciative for all of you making the time, Anne-Marie, for you being here today. Really excited about the conversation. And another big round of applause for Nicole and Jackie.
Yes.
I thought did an excellent job. Jackie was just presenting material that we've never released before. So this is a new methodology for us. We've measured skills gaps previously, but not with this methodology. And you can see it's really exciting what's going to be possible. In terms of your observation, you thought you knew LinkedIn. This is a different LinkedIn that was just presented. They're one and the same, but you're absolutely right. The average member of LinkedIn today and what they experience is somewhat different than what was just described. There's a front-end, a user-facing experience that was largely built as a professional graph. So if a graph is mapping connections,
right.
LinkedIn was founded as a professional graph. That's what you experience. Yeah. That's the network. That's the way in which we connect people to other people, to the information they need, to the opportunities that they're looking for. And that's very much related to our mission statement. This is the other way of thinking about it. There's kind of this front-end experience, and then behind the scenes, this extraordinary platform with all of this data. Another way of thinking about it is our mission and our vision. What you were describing is our mission, to connect the world's professionals, to make them more productive and successful. And at the heart of that mission statement is an addressable opportunity of roughly 780 million or so knowledge workers or professionals. Several years ago, it became apparent to us, and you could hear it in that very gracious introduction, as we were growing from what was 33 million about 10 years ago to approximating 550 million today, it became clear that the mission was in sight, at least the top of that funnel in terms of connecting the knowledge workers. We still had a lot of work to do to engage them and create value for them. But our vision has always been to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce, north of 3 billion people in the global workforce. And growing. Growing very fast. And we had always delineated between vision and mission. For us, the mission was an overarching objective, measurable, realizable, and hopefully inspirational. The vision was designed to inspire. It was true north. It was not something we were measuring success against. And it was the dream. And people were inspired by it, and it served its role. As the membership continued to grow, and much faster than we originally anticipated, we did something that I've never done in business before, and it started about 5 or so years ago. We decided we were going to operationalize our vision. We were going to measure success against the vision statement. And it changed everything. And I'll give you an example. When I first started at LinkedIn, December of 2008, shortly thereafter, I was doing deep dives with various teams and coming up to speed on the business. And our jobs team was describing the fact that we had somewhere on the order of 6,000 to 8,000 jobs listed on LinkedIn.
Wow.
6,000, not 6 million, 6,000. And in those early days, we felt like there was a six-figure addressable opportunity over time as the team became more sophisticated, decided that there were roughly 350,000 high-value professional jobs that we should have on the site. And the team was working towards that end. When we decided to operationalize the vision, we began to identify a different kind of addressable, which was roughly 20 million jobs that were digitally accessible and open at any time. The material on the walls and in the presentation cited 14 million. We're up to north of 15 million jobs today that are available on LinkedIn, from roughly 300 to 350,000 about 4 or 5 years ago. That changed. Everything about that team, that roadmap, those priorities, our investment, our technology, the infrastructural needs changed when we decided we were going to operationalize the vision. And the same thing has happened across all 6 of those pillars. I could do an equal discussion across all 6. So ultimately, you are absolutely right. Your observation is absolutely right. This is a part of LinkedIn that you don't necessarily see day to day. But with things like skills gaps analytics, what we presented in October of last year at our largest customer event, Talent Connect, our talent analytics, where we can do this for companies. So any given company can see the fastest growing jobs, the fastest growing required skills, the skills of their current workforce, the gap, and then start to invest in a workforce strategy that enables them to deliver the right learning and development materials. So this is now all coming to fruition. It's all coming together. It's all the same company. It's all ultimately going to be part of the same infrastructure and same product offering. But it's definitely a work in progress.
So you mentioned, you anticipated my next question, because the front end is a user experience for all of us looking for jobs, and again, employers, employees. And so I was going to ask you, so who then uses, and I appreciate it's not just the back end, it's that other side, it's the taking the result of all those relationships and making a graph, making it real by making it virtual in a way, by mapping it. But companies can use it, but I worked in the US government in the State Department, and we needed all sorts of statistics of various kinds. I never worked in the Labor Bureau, but the BLS obviously is the place that comes out with these statistics. I would think that this is the kind of mapping the economy that traditionally has been the preserve of the Federal Reserve banks across the country, or state governments or federal governments. How do you see this intersecting with the kind of mapping we need, not just to hire individually, but to set those policies?
Ideally in partnership and working together. The government, and not only the government of the United States, but governments all over the world, have access to certain kinds of data we'll never have access to.
Right.
They have objectives that we can help them accelerate the realization of. So hopefully this is the beginning of wonderful partnerships. And this has been ongoing now for several years. This kind of analytical framework helps us create even more value. But starting 2 or 3 years ago, we created, somewhat manually, dashboards, economic graph dashboards, and literally could pick any locality anywhere in the world and identify what I was talking about earlier within the context of a company. We could see the fastest growing jobs, the skills required to obtain those jobs. We could also see for any given locality who was graduating with what skill set, from what schools within the region. The extent to which companies were hiring in the region, the fastest growing companies within the region, inflows of talent from other geographic regions, and outflows of talent to other geographic regions. And as you might imagine, this is extremely valuable information for government leadership that's trying to create economic opportunity for their constituents. So that's cities in the United States, it's cities around the world, it's countries around the world. We've been doing some really cool stuff with Singapore. Prime Minister Modi in India completely gets this and has real vision in terms of what's possible by virtue of partnering with LinkedIn to help us understand where the jobs are going to be in India, what skills the citizens of India need, and how we can help him get ahead of that curve and create the right learning and development and training materials to train his workforce for the jobs that are and will be, and not just the jobs that once were. So there's all kinds of opportunities for us to work in partnership with governments.
I want to ask then about how, so let's imagine indeed really effective communities are going to require the public sector, the private sector, and the civic sector working together. And so let's imagine you actually have a city that has that happening. I was actually just in Flint, right? So in lots of analyses of those cities where they have lots of jobs, they're generating demand, people are moving in on your graph, all the places people are moving into, well, they're moving out of places like Flint. And yet, frankly, as a country, we're going to have to be addressing Flint, Michigan, as well as Seattle and or Austin or all these other places. How then would you think about the policies? So you can show, you can say, hey, you're losing people. You're losing the very skilled people you need, and you want to keep those people. How do you move from that to the kind of policies that can make that happen?
So people are going to go to where the jobs are with a very, very important caveat that they can afford to move to the cities where those jobs exist. So I think in terms of public influence or subsidies or incentives or what the government can do, what kind of programs and policies can be created to facilitate this movement in the right direction. There's the supply of talent, and then there's the supply of the jobs. In terms of the jobs, you could see from Jackie's presentation earlier the migration to and from particular cities and for particular jobs. I don't think the knee-jerk response of a city with a surplus of talent is going to lose that talent to where the cities have great demand for that talent. I think in part governments can start to create incentives for companies to open up offices where the talent already is. For starters, we need to make sure that the companies who are in need of those skill sets and those people are aware of where the talent is. So that's the first thing that needs to change, is facilitating the distribution of this information and data, which hopefully we can play a role in. Next is there a natural movement towards that geography where the talent exists? Should company A be opening up shop there? To the extent they don't find it economically feasible, it doesn't make sense from an ROI perspective, to what extent can the government get involved to create the right kind of subsidies, tax subsidies, other incentives, so that those companies are creating jobs in those places? And I think we all realize to some extent, it's not just going to come down to the public sector and policies. The private sector also needs to take some responsibility here. We had to look ourselves in the mirror. Again, Jackie in her intro mentioned we have 30 cities, offices in 30 cities around the world. And when we looked at the cities in which we operated, one of the things that became increasingly clear to us was it's where there's increasingly economic development and growth and what you would imagine. It makes perfect sense, it's logical and intuitive. We didn't have an office in Flint or Detroit. And so the head of our sales team, Mike Gamson, said, we've got to start leading by example. We're talking about all this stuff. What are we doing about it? We open up an office in Detroit, and it's not a symbolic gesture. We need to start making a difference. Other companies do as well. So I think that's where it sits in terms of the companies and the offerings. In terms of the talent, again, from a public sector perspective, talent needs to be incented to move to where the jobs are. And unfortunately, some in the audience may realize this, but migration in the United States is at a low, post-World War II low. And it's kind of an Occam's razor solution to it. It's not necessarily asymmetry of information that may exist to some extent. People can't afford to go to where the jobs are. This is a very, very vicious cycle. So what are we doing to subsidize or incentivize people to move to where the jobs are? When as I was listening to the presentation, I turned to Anne-Marie and I said, it's funny, I'd never thought about this before, but when I first moved to the West Coast, to LA from Boston, it was for a job at Warner Brothers, and they put me up in corporate housing. It was in Burbank. It got
Nice.
the job. It got the job done. It got the job done. I tried to get out of there as soon as possible, and I got an apartment on the west side. But it made it much easier. And so, what are we doing to create housing, even temporary housing, subsidies, so that people can be onboarded in these new regions that they might not be able to afford, and make sure that they are up and running and earning an income and hopefully able to then take care of themselves and continue to prosper. So there's definitely things that can be done. The good news, I don't think any of us have all the answers, the data now exists. The infrastructure now exists to take a lot of the guesswork out of this. And so if we can take the guesswork out of this, I think as long as we're all aligned on what we're trying to solve for, we can start to put real solutions in place.
So let's think about the this mobility issue and think about it also in terms of the future of work, because this is one of the things that you look at a graph like this, and I want to come back to some of the specific skills, because I'm fascinated with the way you define skills and the way actually you're building on how people define skills themselves. So I want to come back to that. But before that, though, when we think about mobility, and when you look at the graph that you presented, the economic graph you presented, what the worry is exactly that you see big hubs and they keep getting bigger. That's the power law. That's the scale-free networks, right? And that's the way the internet evolved. When you have a big portal, it just keeps getting bigger, and the places left behind get further and further behind, or smaller and smaller. So we have to think about how are you going to distribute that workforce, as well as make sure the gaps are filled, but that they're filled in a more distributed way. But part of it is that people can't afford to move to the cities. Part of it is they cannot afford to leave where they are. And a big piece of this is the care equation. Because, that decline in mobility that many people see, and there are many reasons, but one of them is women have gone into the workplace. Before, if you moved, if somebody moved, your wife moved with you, and she got the kids in school and the doctor's appointments, and she did all that, and she stayed home and cared for them. Now, if you have a care situation, often with your family or or your husband's family, however you've worked it out, you can't move. There's a whole layer there, and that's public policy that LinkedIn is not going to be shaping, but it's around healthcare and early ed and childcare. But when you look at that and you start to worry about the people who are stuck, who are really stuck, the danger is that they get further and further behind. They can't move. It's not housing or incentives. They just can't move because you'd have to move their whole family. So how do we think just more broadly about the workers who either are not on LinkedIn or who are, but just can't move? And how do we prevent them from getting further behind? Because politically, that's just a huge issue.
So two things come to mind immediately, and you're absolutely right, in terms of things beyond cost and the cost of living within a city that has fast-growing jobs available. Remote work and leveraging new technologies, evolving technologies. It's funny, I was just meeting with our DC team earlier, LinkedIn's DC team, which has grown. We have an office of about 25 people here, combination of government relations, sales, et cetera. And a good portion of the people in the office are not doing their work in DC per se. They're supporting LinkedIn offices elsewhere. Right. We had two talent acquisition professionals, recruiters. And I was like, are we growing the office here so quickly that we need two recruiters here in the DC office? They said, no, we're supporting offices all over. We're supporting the offices in San Francisco. We're supporting the recruiting efforts in product marketing, and of course they are. They don't have to be in the Bay Area to do that. And there were multiple examples of this. And it's just there were managers of our teams in New York, in DC. Why? Because the talent is here. Right. We don't have to have them living in New York. They're traveling from time to time. But it was really eye-opening, and this is happening more and more. It's not just at LinkedIn, it's not just within the United States, it's happening globally. So all companies should be starting to revisit where people are working, where the work is happening, and investing in the capabilities and the technologies to facilitate work happening remotely. One. Two, companies need to be investing in training outside of their initial sphere of influence. We all have to extend ourselves. Otherwise, this massively vicious cycle is going to grow to the point where all companies will be harmed because, listen, if these individuals can't afford the products and the services of the companies that are creating them because they can't earn a real living, then everyone is harmed. The economy is harmed. The companies are. It's in everyone's best interest to make that investment.
So that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that. One of the things you can do if you show that Mississippi is rich in one set of skills that a company in Minnesota needs, they can hire from that city in Mississippi without necessarily moving. So you actually can show where you should be hiring for a place that has the talent you need without moving them. That's interesting.
And not just an issue of technology. Technology would be a foundational component of that in terms of facilitating the change in behavior. It's also cultural.
Yeah.
So, 7, 8, 9 years ago, in the earlier parts of my tenure at LinkedIn, I would have told you that as a first principle, as many people as possible need to be working under the same roof together. And that was based on my previous experiences. And I hung on to that with everything I had until, out of sheer necessity, I mean, in Silicon Valley, you just couldn't have the geographic proximity by virtue of supply-demand imbalances. So we had to open up other offices, and you adapt. Yep. You evolve.
Yep. You become a network.
Of course, if you figure it out. And that's the way of the world.
So let's talk about specific skills. I mean, obviously, when Jackie was talking, everybody thinks we need coders. And nobody, I think, in this town would have thought that the big gap is communication skills. I mean, this is the city of strategic communications firms. So that in itself is just to sort of challenge our assumptions about STEM, about, well, this is the hot, shiny new thing, the economy, where it appears the economy is going, but actually that soft skills are in greater demand. And I will just say there's a book called The Fuzzy and the Techie by Scott Hartley that makes the case that in fact in Silicon Valley, humanities majors have done better than science majors. You need to get in your first job, often you need a certain set of quantitative skills, but the folks who've taken off are often in that. I mean, humanities teaches us empathy and an ability to identify with others in all sorts of ways. But how do you think about the skills we're going to need? Because that is, we talk about the skills gap, and at the same time, I tell people all the time that when I graduated from college, my father could say to me, go to law school, get a job in a law firm, make partner, and you are set for life. I have 2 sons. There is nothing, they're 19 and 21, there's nothing I can tell them that I'm certain about set for life, because all I know is that the jobs they're going to hold don't exist now, and many of the jobs you would train them for now will not exist. So how do you think about that?
So that covered a lot of ground. So it's fantastic. But we
wasn't exactly a question. It was more
it's
like
great.
A disquisition.
It was fantastic. So just to parse it a little bit. So the last thing that you said, I couldn't agree with more. The days in which people studied, learned a trade, learned a discipline, a major, got a job, and were set for life. I think those days are coming to an end if they're not already over. Yep. The world is changing too quickly. And so one of the core skills is the ability to steepen your learning curve. Every individual needs to relearn how to learn. And certainly intellectual curiosity is going to go a long way. But I think everyone needs to become a learner again. So I think that's really important. As far as skills, it depends really on one's station in life, where one is, and what we're trying to solve for. I think if we're going all the way back to primary school, and we talked a little bit about this prior to coming on stage, I think our schools need to increasingly be focused on critical reasoning, creative problem solving, and collaboration. I think those are becoming foundational skills in a modern, more digital, more global, more networked world. And you could see it in terms of the gap with regard to communication, and specifically team building and collaboration. I think above and beyond that, it's really important for people to have basic digital fluency. There's a lot of talk within STEM circles about coding, and in a perfect world, everyone would be an AI expert. But just digital fluency, the ability you saw in Jackie's presentation to communicate digitally via email, to create a presentation, a Word document, facility with a spreadsheet. And one of the reasons for the importance of that is that with the rise of advanced technology and the number of jobs that are going to be displaced and the number of jobs that are going to evolve to the point where people need to be reskilled and retrained, even if they still have their existing jobs, it's really important that you have a strong foundation in place, because when you have to learn multiple skills concurrently, it compounds the challenge and the difficulty. If you have that digital fluency in place, you are much better positioned to learn that next new skill. So I think that's going to be really important as well. And then, it's not going to hurt to code. You have organizations like code.org that are trying to ensure that every classroom in the United States is teaching basic programming skills. And I'm very thankful for that effort, because I think it's going to make a world of difference. So, there's multiple ways to approach it.
Coding is the new French, right? I mean, in the sense that it's a language. And everyone, when I grew up anyway, everyone took one foreign language, and it was generally French. And at this point, because I actually don't think people will need to code. In the sense it'll be more like Lego, where you're going to be able to snap together blocks of prepared code. But I do think it's just like learning a foreign language makes you much more sensitive to other cultures, and it just trains a part of your brain you need, that coding in some computer language would be the same.
I think also on the interpersonal skills front, we touched on the gap that exists with regard to communications, but it's also not just communication, but just being a human being. And I know you've done a lot of work in terms of where job opportunities will continue to exist in areas that won't be as easily replicated or replaced by machines. And those interpersonal skills matter. We see, and it's oftentimes counterintuitive given everyone's discussion about AI and the rise of the robot, but sales development folks, account executives, business development executives, these are people in great demand, and we see skills gaps existing along those lines. Human beings are not going to be replaced across the board anytime soon. There are going to be industries, there are going to be segments, there are going to be jobs that will be displaced, that will require change. But it's funny, Elon Musk just very recently has learned, after, I guess, going very deep on the production process for the 3, that they may have overinvested in automation.
Yeah.
And he recently tweeted that it turns out human beings may have been underrated.
Well,
Not sure if you saw that, but
there's hope for us yet.
There's hope for humanity.
So another piece of I think what the graph reveals that I found fascinating is Jackie was talking. She said, "Well, here there are shortage of communication skills, critical reasoning skills, and working in teams." And so I thought, okay, so if I'm on LinkedIn and I want to advertise that I have what people are looking for, I would say I'm a communicator, I'm a reasoner, and I'm a team worker, or I'm a thinker. That generally emphasizing your soft skills is often seen as essentially disguising the fact you have no hard skills. In other words, in the way, that is not something that people jump to. I often note on LinkedIn or on Twitter, people say, I'm a connector. I actually think connectors are hugely important, that ability to bring people together in the right way for the right purposes, but that is not a skill employers are willing to pay for, and often it makes them suspicious that if you say I'm a financial analyst, I have these programming languages, I understand statistical analysis, that's the kind of thing that people think, yes, that hard-soft dichotomy still plays, I think, to the advantage of hard skills, and yet you're showing soft skills are the ones we need. So how do we tweak the way we define those skills or proclaim that we have them in a way that actually gets employers to hire you?
It's a great observation and question. I think it's starting to change. It's already starting to change. I think in historically hierarchical organizations where there was domain expertise and whether it was a financial analyst or an engineer, those were always very highly valued. I think increasingly as organizations become flatter, as the network within an organization or around the world becomes stronger and the connections between people, I think companies are increasingly emphasizing and finding value in the ability for people to communicate with one another, to collaborate, to inspire and motivate, to evaluate, to coach, to teach.
I love all those terms.
Yeah, so I think it's gonna take some time before that becomes increasingly explicit, so that those are skills that are being sought out. But the reason we're able to show those gaps exist is because people are posting jobs looking for exactly those skills, and those jobs are going unfilled. So I think we're already starting to see some change there. But you're right. Historically, those softer skills were not deemed as valuable. I do think it's going to change.
And are you thinking about working with people to certify or badge them? Because that's the other problem. If I say I'm a financial analyst, you can tell whether I am or not pretty quickly. I can give you tangible proof that I've done these things, and you know. But if I say I'm a communicator, I'm an empathizer, I'm a collaborator, it's harder to know. So are there ways to certify that?
I think ultimately there will be. I don't know that it's necessarily going to be LinkedIn as a principal in the certification business. It may, but ultimately I see our role more as a platform.
Yep.
And for the companies that are generating those certifications to easily be able to plug those in. So once you have passed a particular course, wherever you're studying, that company, if they have the right relationship with LinkedIn, would be able to flip a switch and your certification ends up showing up in your LinkedIn profile. That's only one part of the equation. What's going to have to happen for this to work, and listen, I would love nothing more than for this to happen as soon as possible, because I think we spend too much time and energy on the idea that degrees are the end-all be-all. And degrees are important and they matter, and that kind of education is incredibly valuable. But it shouldn't have to be a mutually exclusionary debate as to whether it's degrees versus skills. It's degrees and skills, and we all need to recognize there's a lot of people out there that don't have access to a 4-year degree, particularly from a prestigious university that a lot of companies exclusively recruit from. And yet, these graduates from school, these young adults, they have the aptitude, they have the grit, they have the perseverance, they have the growth mindset, they have the kind of learning curves I was talking about earlier. They know how to overcome adversity. They're hungry. They're passionate. Yeah. They're going to kick ass if given a chance. But they've got to be given a chance. And so what will happen, ideally, is once they're certified, once they're going through less traditional routes, and companies hire them based on their certification by virtue, in the future, of doing a search on LinkedIn for someone with that certification, and they're in place and they're successful, that's when change starts to happen, because then companies say, I want more like that. You know, where do we find this person? They're incredible. And at the end of the day, because there is a talent crunch right now, companies are going to go to where they can solve the problem.
Great. So it is time to hear from all of you. Do not follow my example, and do ask a question. So no disquisitions from you, please. Floor is open. You're in the front.
Is it on? Great.
Yeah, there it is.
Thank you so much. Should I introduce myself?
Yes, please do.
Hi, my name is Liz Wilkie. I'm one of the directors in the economics department at the Millennium Challenge Corporation.
Oh, great.
Anne-Marie, you actually spoke there not that long ago. It seems to me sort of these soft skills require lots of things like emotional intelligence, critical thinking, maturity, impulse control.
Everything kids need. Sorry. Yes.
Right. What strikes me is that lots of these skills are skills that people in high socioeconomic statuses have through their networks, through their peers, through their education, through their families, and that people in lower socioeconomic statuses tend not to develop, or tend to develop with much more difficulty. As the future of work evolves towards these soft skills, there seems to me to be a very implied problem of inclusion. And how do we touch people sort of at the bottom end? I know LinkedIn has its own challenges, right, with attracting people that are not sort of on high-skilled professional levels. How does LinkedIn view the sort of increasingly unequal distribution of the skills that are going to be really critical to future work? And how do they see their role in trying to bridge that gap in order to help people sort of build and maintain the soft skills that they may not be currently touching, but may be important to touch in the future for inclusion reasons?
Yeah, so it comes back to that vision statement to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce, not just knowledge workers, not just high-value, high-skilled professionals, and we take that very seriously. We have an organization within LinkedIn called LinkedIn for Good, and their priorities are about serving the underserved communities within our membership and the broader population. So unemployed youth, veterans, refugees, and the numbers may not be as big, but we feel like it's an obligation, a moral obligation. This isn't just about business. It's not just about revenue. It's also about the realization of our purpose, the role we believe that we play in the world. In terms of the specific concern that you articulated, I couldn't agree more. And it's incumbent upon those responsible for creating the curriculum and our educational infrastructure, whether it's the public sector or the private sector, and people just getting more involved. We need to do better. So by way of example, it's not through LinkedIn per se, but one of the things I feel personally very strongly about is the importance of teaching compassion, which didn't come up when we were talking about some of the necessary skills. But you know, the world's becoming increasingly tribal, and digital technologies are accelerating those trends. And we all now increasingly have the wherewithal to self-select into in-groups that sound like us and look like us and agree with us. And that's not good for anyone. The same technology can be utilized for people to be able to share their perspectives, their unique perspectives on the world, and for others to learn from that and them, and to walk a mile in their shoes. And I believe this should start in primary school, and that compassion can be taught. Working with an organization actually in DC called EverFi to develop a curriculum around compassion, and we're looking forward to rolling that out in September. And so it doesn't need to stop with compassion. All of the EQ, high EQ skill sets that you were referring to earlier should increasingly be baked into our general curriculum. And social emotional learning is not a new concept, and thankfully you are seeing more and more schools pursuing that. But you raised a really important point, which is there's probably going to be a very high correlation with the income, the median income for a particular school community, and their emphasis on that kind of skill or skills. So we just need to do better by the underserved communities.
The mic is coming your way that way. There you go.
Thank you. Brian Wilson, Director of the Workforce Data Quality Campaign here in DC. So your data for the economic graph is based upon a sample that's drawn from individuals and employers that are part of LinkedIn. This sample obviously isn't the universe of workers and employers. It's not a scientifically drawn random sample of workers and skills and employers. In order for policymakers and others to use this data from the economic graph, how are you recommending folks take into account that this is a particular sample of data that isn't necessarily, unless you've come up with adjustment techniques, representative of the full universe of the supply and demand for skills?
So I'll start, and Jackie or Guy, members of our teams, our economics team, can chime in. It starts by being completely transparent in terms of the methodology, in terms of the shortcomings. We're not trying to misrepresent what this is about. We have access to certain kinds of data, and we want to be able to leverage that data to create value for organizations and for people. And you saw some of the results of that. I think there are going to be limitations until we have a broader cross-section. And one of the ways that we can solve for that is forging partnerships with organizations, whether they're governments or NGOs or companies, to gain access to a broader set of data that we can start running through the same infrastructure that we're utilizing to generate these insights. Jackie or Guy, anyone?
Great point. That's something that we're always thinking about and have tried to make sure that we are accounting for things such as the fact that our membership base has greatly ramped up, and we don't want to say things like, just because we have an increase from, I think it was the 33 million when he started to close to 550 now, that indicates that there is more supply or more demand. So we have various techniques for making adjustments for things that are happening on our platform, and also making sure that, to the best we can, reflecting what's happening in the real world.
Right there. And then it'll come.
Hi, Ian Colgren from Politico. I wanted to ask a question about the working class component of all this. Before you even talk about how, you start to solve skills gaps among working class people, I'd imagine it would be hard even for LinkedIn to have an idea into where some of the job shortages and surpluses are for people who are not even on the platform or not necessarily digitally equipped and have a lot of steps that they would need to take before they could get to, say, working remotely for a team in another city like you were talking about. So if you could give some insight on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so couldn't agree more. And for starters, and it comes back to what it takes to operationalize and manifest our vision, we are increasingly focused on middle skill workers and blue collar workers and jobs. And it turns out that we have far more of those jobs as part of our index than we realized historically. We need to do a better job of standardizing some of the data and cleaning up the job posts that are in the index. But we were very pleasantly surprised by some of the numbers that we saw. And we think if we can start to create a situation where we have a comprehensive list of middle skilled jobs available on LinkedIn, not only is it going to serve the middle skilled workers already on LinkedIn, and I'll come back to that in just a second, but it's going to attract new members that go beyond our core. And that starts to build on itself. And then you get the power of the network where those middle skilled workers are inviting other middle skilled workers that they know and leveraging their networks. And the power of a network, the ability to leverage people that you know and their knowledge and their information, the opportunities that they have access to, that's universal. That's not specific to any one segment or sector. It turns out we have more blue collar workers or middle skill members than one may imagine. Roughly 20 to 25 million here in the US, north of 80 million globally. And that was without focusing on it to the extent that we're going to be focusing on it going forward.
Right there, yeah.
Long from the Washington Post.
Media row.
Yeah, it's the media row. I'd like to hear what more you think the government should be doing on retraining and reskilling. You talked in your remarks that you think the government should do more to incentivize workers to move and to incentivize companies to locate where the workers are. But there's so much focus right now in Washington on retraining. What's your message to the lawmakers on that?
It's not dissimilar from what we've been talking about thus far, which is we're in a position now, whether it's LinkedIn or other similar platforms, where we have collectively access to data that will enable us to better understand what's happening and proactively address it. So I don't think this is going to fall within the realm of the public sector exclusively, government specifically, or universities, junior colleges, vocational training facilities, or companies. I think we all need to be working in partnership. It's not going to hurt for the government to be investing more money in retraining and reskilling. It's certainly not going to hurt for the government to be providing the right incentives to companies to be providing the right reskilling and the right training for their employees. The company should have the best insight into what they need. I say should because that may not always be the case for a whole host of reasons. But companies are on the front lines. Companies see where the growth opportunities are. They see what's in the pipeline in terms of new products and services they're going to be launching. They should have a grasp, and I say should, and I'll come back to that in just a second, of the skills that their current workforce possesses. Not all do, and just like the government, companies are now in a position where they can get access to that data. This stuff does exist. So we can start to answer questions that historically we were not able to answer. And if we can work in partnership, government, private sector, and the educational sector, so whether it is four-year universities or junior colleges, two-year programs, or vocational training facilities, stronger partnership between the companies and the educational sector to say, hey, this is where we're going to be hiring. Wouldn't it be great if you bake this into your curriculum so that you can train people for the jobs we know are going to be there by the time your students are graduating?
So there was a question over here because I've been discriminating in favor of the left. But do you have a?
I think Julie's saying one more.
What you saying?
Time
once.
for one more.
Okay.
Who's the last one?
So I think over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Mark Rucci. I'm with the Rise of the Rest Seed Fund at Revolution. I wanted to talk a little bit more about your decision to open an office in Detroit. And can you talk about how LinkedIn is prepared to be a partner in the Detroit ecosystem, both with universities, the startup community, and other businesses there, as opposed to just opening that office, hiring outside talent, and bringing them in, but actually really partnering with the community?
Yeah, it starts with the kind of work that we've been talking about today. So our economic graph team, our GR team, sitting down with local officials to understand what they're trying to solve for, to make sure they have access to the data that we're seeing and the trends that we're seeing, and then start to prioritize what they'd like to solve for, how we can make a difference. So that's at the highest level in terms of tops down, in terms of scale. There's also, just from a bottoms up perspective, being a part of the community. In Silicon Valley, we work very closely with a number of organizations like the Boys and Girls Club of the Peninsula, Year Up, Management Leaders for Tomorrow, who provide a pipeline into just unbelievable talent that we wouldn't necessarily have access to. And those are locally forged relationships. So I would, I'm looking forward to our team in Detroit being able to do the same thing there.
Okay, I think one more.
One more.
Very last, one more. You're the last
my name is Audrey Hutchinson, and I'm with the National League of Cities. We are the oldest and largest organization representing mayors and council members across the country. And we have had the privilege of partnering with LinkedIn over the last 2 years, working with 6 cities around their building equitable pathways to post-secondary and workforce success, creating multi-sector partnerships on the ground. LinkedIn traveled with us across the country, really sharing the data with teams of business leaders, mayors, community organizations. I heard somebody talked about people who are not necessarily LinkedIn members. And so the work that we have been trying to do is really thinking about how to lift up certain communities in cities across the country. And the data has been very, very helpful, recognizing that it's not the end all, but it's a complement to the data that cities have and are using. So I just really wanted to give a shout out. Anybody who wants to know more about it, I'll just mention the cities if you're in the room, 3 Texas cities, Houston, Austin, Corpus Christi. We are also in Jacksonville, Florida, Charleston, South Carolina, and have I missed any? Nashville, Tennessee. Thank you, Elizabeth. So anyway, I'm happy to talk about it, but it's been a fantastic partnership, and I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that.
Thank you.
I think we are done. We could talk for much longer, but thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce our 4 esteemed panelists. We are incredibly excited and honored to have Governor Northam here, who was sworn in as the Governor of Virginia this past January. Governor Northam is a U.S. Army veteran, and he was a pediatric neurologist before he served as Virginia's lieutenant governor and being elected into this role just this past November. So please join me in welcoming Governor Northam.
Thank you.
Next, we have Ms. Sheila Bair, who, as you know, served as the chair of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, from 2006 to 2011, where she steered the agency through the 2008 financial crisis. Thank you. You're welcome. Yes, thank you. On behalf of my family and all of America, thank you. She is a former college president and a frequent commentator on financial regulation as well as higher education. And this is my favorite part of her bio. She has twice been named the most powerful woman on the Forbes magazine national list. So with that, please welcome Ms. Sheila Bair. Next, we have former Secretary of Education, John King, who is now the president and CEO of the Education Trust, a national nonprofit organization that identifies and closes opportunity and achievement gaps from preschool all through college. We actually overlapped in the administration, and it's a tremendous honor to be here with you, Secretary King. Thank you. And then finally, our moderator, David Leonhardt, who is a columnist and editor at the New York Times. As you know, he was founding editor of Upshot, which uses data visualizations to offer an analytical approach to the day's news. And he also won a Pulitzer Prize in 2011. Thank you, David. All right. And with that, I will turn it over to David, who will moderate the panel. Thank you.
Thank you for that generous introduction. Thank you for grouping me in with this wonderful group of experts and panelists. This is the nicest space for a panel I think I've ever been in. It energizes me rather than the opposite, which is great. So we want to dive right in. We're going to have a conversation among ourselves at first, and then we're going to open it up to all you. So as you start to think of questions and ideas and disagreements and all that, we want you involved toward the end of it. So I want to start with a broad framing question here. And in some ways it's unfair. I'm asking the three of you to solve the problems of the world, but if folks like you don't, we're in trouble. So as you look around, at one point we talked about putting up a slide. We don't need the slide, but if we have it, now's the time to do it. There it is. So what this slide does, and it comes from some academic work from a bunch of folks who you've heard from, including Emmanuel Saez and Thomas Piketty. What it does is it looks at income growth by different groups for the first few decades after the war and then the few decades since 1980. And the fact that the light blue line is higher than the dark blue line means that basically for nearly every single group of Americans, except for the very rich, income growth has slowed over the last few decades. For many of them, it slowed close to zero once you take inflation into account. And in addition to this graph, you can look at almost any other metric. You can look at net worth. You can look at things that are more important than money. You can look at the really alarming statistics that I know you're grappling with, Governor, about deaths of despair and the opioid crisis. You can look at the percentage of kids who are growing up without two parents, just again and again and again. And then you look at the polling and you see how anxious and frustrated so many Americans are. And it seems to me that that's the backdrop for this entire conversation that we're having. And I realize that this afternoon, sitting here, we can't actually solve all those. I'm obviously not asking each of you for a list of white paper proposals, but I would appreciate it if each of you could kind of frame the way you see this problem and what you think are the most important things we can do to address it. Because it seems to me that it really is the challenge of our times in that it makes every other challenge, including climate change, harder to solve because of the way it affects our society. So Governor, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you, David. And I believe it, as just a child neurologist, I'm going to go through the spectrum, but I think it's all about opportunity and education, and it starts even prenatally. And we want to, and something that we're doing in Virginia is really emphasizing the importance of early childhood education, just to give all of our children that same opportunity. And I remind people all the time that if one family has the means to send their children to like a pre-K program and another family doesn't, that's really what starts the gap between the haves and the have-nots. So that's where we start. Obviously, we're focused on K through 12. I think we've got to jump outside the box and talk about how we educate our children, how we prepare them for 21st century jobs, which are much different from when I was growing up. And then finally, once we know what those jobs of the 21st century are, how we educate folks, making sure that education is accessible and affordable for all individuals. And the last point I want to make just very quickly, in case I don't have a chance, but we have this kind of concept or even a stigma in this country that if our children don't go to a four-year college or university, they're not going to be successful. But a lot of jobs out there are available right now, and you don't need a four-year college education. So I think we really need to focus on our community colleges, certification programs, apprenticeship programs, and even at the high school level, putting more focus on vocational and technical training. So, but it's all about opportunity, and it's all about access to education.
Let me just ask you one follow-up about that, which is, there's a fair amount of skepticism about the value of education, it seems, in some corners of our society. Maybe it's just in the media, but you read a lot about skepticism of education. I don't share that view, but I'd be interested, since you have to get elected and you're a Democratic leader, small d, right. When you encounter that, what do you say to people about the value of education?
Well, I think, again, looking at the jobs of the 21st century, if you don't, not you, but if one doesn't have a skill right now, then they have their hands tied. And so, again, and that's all, I think, centered in the concept of education. But I think we really have to reach out to our children and their families at a younger age, even in elementary school, middle school, and talk about the opportunities, talk about what the jobs of the 21st century are, and ask the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they may not know, and that's okay, but at least expose them to different career paths and fields and help them on their way to that path. And so, again, I think we have to look at different ways of educating our children, but really preparing them for the 21st century workforce.
Sheila, how do you think about this stagnation in the growth of living standards and what we can do about it?
Well, let me put my finance hat on for a minute, and then I'll put my educator hat on. First, let me correct the record. I was actually the second most powerful woman in the world in 2008 and 2009, but thanks for the booze. In 2010, I actually dropped to number 14 as I was leaving the FDIC. I was behind Lady Gaga. I was just devastated. Anyway,
who was number one when you were number
Angela
two?
Merkel, of course.
Angela
Merkel. So, look, I think part of the problem is as real wages have declined, especially with the lower and middle income, and you're right, this has been going on for at least a couple decades, we kind of doubled down on debt to make up for the difference, right? So people were trying to maintain their standard of living by borrowing, and they were borrowing off of their houses, and that didn't end up so well. And but I think with the financialization of our economy, there has been too much a reliance on providing credit as a means of trying to open up windows of opportunity as opposed to really fundamentals like good education to get a good job, good skills, have real wage growth, which is sustainable, which debt is not. I think we've also relied too much on monetary policy to juice our economy. And that's, again, not just sustainable because that just makes it cheap to borrow. So, and then the people who typically can do that are the wealthier people, and they invest in assets. So it's called the wealth effect. So the stock market goes up. Everything's gone up now, but those assets are predominantly owned by wealthier people. And so if you are just relying on wage income and don't, and a lot of people don't own a house now because of the crisis, then they lost their houses, and that was a very tragic, one of the many tragic outcomes. You get the kind of disparities you see in that chart. And and then I think we also penalize work in a way that's really unhelpful. You need to look at tax policy. I was really disappointed in this tax bill. There was such an opportunity to do some meaningful reform. But you think about the ways we penalize people who want to get out there and work and try to get ahead. You've got we tax labor income at a much higher rate, top rates than we tax investment income. You lop onto that the payroll taxes that are highly regressive. I mean, some college graduates can be making $45,000, $50,000 a year if they're lucky when they graduate. Half of that's probably going to be going to state, local, and payroll taxes and other things. So, we have to look at the disincentives and the penalties that we provide for work too. And that I think and then the biggest problem now is that doubling down on debt again, these kids are all borrowing tons and tons of money to get to go to school, and so that a further burden on them and their futures. But it also hurts the economy because they're paying off debt as opposed to buying a car or starting a business or just other personal consumption. That's a huge drag on the economy as well. So I think there's an intersection of some of the financial policies that have been unwise and how they've distracted us from really fundamentals that will get real wage growth going. It's amazing to me that politicians don't even talk about it that much. I mean, that's the only thing I'd be talking about right now is how to generate real wage growth with lower middle income families. And that's through education, that's through a lot of different things. But our economic future for all of us depends on it because we're a consumer-driven economy. And if we can't get real wage growth up, our economy is going to continue to reflect numbers like that and stagnate because that's not the rich people, that's not where the demand comes from. So I'm a big fan of income share agreements. I think is one way to get away from the debt model to an equity model to fund college, and we can probably talk about that more later. But again, I think that the lack of smarter policies and spending decisions on education is symptomatic of a greater need to that we're not prioritizing real wage growth and giving people a sustainable way to make a living and have a positive economic future.
I just want to briefly underline your point about the payroll tax, right? We just had this
Yeah.
months-long debate about tax policy here in Washington. Whatever you think of the bill, like you, I'm not a big fan of it, but whatever you think of the bill, we spent no time talking about the payroll tax. We spent the entire time talking about the income tax. Most Americans, more Americans pay more in payroll tax than income tax.
Absolutely.
For most Americans, the payroll tax is a larger tax than the income tax, and it was completely missing from the debate.
Yeah, if you want true middle class relief, that's you really need to look at that, and there was no discussion at all. Yeah, that's true.
So John, how do you think about this great stagnation and what we can do about it?
Yeah, well, I agree with everything that was said. I would add two things. One is I think the governor's point about investing in education is exactly right. Obviously, I'm biased, but I feel very strongly that all the evidence is that as people gain in educational attainment, all the outcomes you worried about get better, right? For folks who have higher educational attainment, unemployment is lower, health outcomes are better, family stability is higher. Good things happen when people get a quality education. The thing I would add to what the governor said is that we have a huge equity problem in our education system, such that the kids who need the most get the least. Right? So today, a majority of kids in the nation's public schools are kids of color. A majority of kids in the nation's public schools are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. So if we don't educate low-income students and students of color, we have no future as a country. Our economy has no future. Our democracy has no future. Given that, it is outrageous that we actually spend less and do less for the kids who need the most. They are the low-income students and students of color are getting less resources in their schools on average. They are getting less access to effective teachers. They are getting less access to advanced coursework. They're getting less access to school counselors. You just run down the issues. We are not addressing education equity, and that is a K-12 problem, but it's also a higher ed problem. Oftentimes, low-income students, students of color, first-gen students are disproportionately at higher ed institutions in which we underinvest. So the equity piece, I think, is a critical component to go along with the investment in education. The other thing I'd say is when you talk to students or working moms who are trying to move ahead and you ask what are the obstacles to mobility, there are a set of things that you hear that government can help to solve. You hear transportation. I can't get to where the jobs are. I think about folks in Baltimore who are trapped in neighborhoods where there's really no viable way to get on time to work in the places where the jobs are. Right? Government can do something about that. I think about the governor's amazing leadership on Medicaid access. If you don't have access to health care, right, that's going to get in the way of you pursuing whatever type of economic mobility you want for yourself and for your kids. We know actually that adults who don't have access to health care are less likely to take their kids to their doctor's appointments, even if their kids have health care. Right? So we got to address that. Child care. I was at Lehman College in the Bronx last week talking with students who said, you know, one of the great things is we have childcare on campus. It's from 9 to 5. It's great, except I work and my classes are from 5 to 9.
Right.
And so it doesn't help me, actually, because I need a way to have my kids cared for while I'm in class. Right? For lots of working parents, access to quality childcare is the difference between whether or not they can pursue education, whether or not they can move ahead in the economy. So there are all these tangible things we could do, but to your point about payroll tax issues, we're not talking about the things that government could do to help people and create a mobility society. And I think we're missing an opportunity, and it's to our detriment.
Since John mentioned Medicaid, Governor, can you talk a little bit about it? I mean, my impression, and I say this in part so you can correct me, is the House in Virginia has passed it, which they've done before. And so now it depends on the Senate doing it, but you have a secret plan, I hear, to get the Senate to pass it.
Yeah, I'm going to reveal it right now.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, I would just preface my comments that no individual, no family should be one medical illness away from financial demise. And that's where we are in this country and in particular in Virginia right now. So with the Affordable Care Act, we have the opportunity to expand health care to, in Virginia, about 400,000 working Virginians. Also, I would say that every day we don't expand health care, every day that we don't take advantage of expansion of Medicaid, not only are we leaving on the table, but we're giving to surrounding states who we compete with, by the way, over $5 million a day. So The answer to your question, we are still working on our budget in Virginia, and I think this is a striking number. The House budget includes expansion, the Senate budget doesn't. The difference between the two, whether we accept Medicaid expansion or not, is $400 million a year. So $400 million a year that could be used for access to health care, it could be used for higher education, K through 12 education, raises for law enforcement, and finally something that you touched on very briefly earlier is our opioid crisis. And if you want to talk about the largest challenge that this country has right now, this past year in Virginia, we lost 1,227 Virginians to opioid overdose. That's a lot of people. That's about 4 a day. And it's just something that is tearing into our economy, tearing into our families, and something that we need to wrap our arms around.
My impression, and we won't go too much in the weeds here, but it's so important and interesting right now. I just want to ask you one more thing about Medicaid. My impression is that the new version of the House bill includes some provisions about work requirements that may make it more likely that it passes the Senate this time. Is that right?
Well, they throw out that word, work requirement, and just so people know, I don't condone that concept. I think I would refer to it as work search. If there are individuals that we can help get back into the workforce, that's great. But we should offer a carrot rather than a stick, and not penalize people, and really not create more bureaucracy. So the simpler we can do by expanding Medicaid, the more resources that we'll have. And I remind people of this all the time. There are consequences to limited resources. And so there is no need for any business, and in this case, no need for a state to be giving resources to other states when we could be using it right here in Virginia.
What I've read about the sort of work conditions makes me think they're not a great idea, but that if it's what's needed to get the bill passed, it's okay.
Yes, and again, not to get into the weeds too much, but you're looking at people between 100% and 138% poverty. Most of those individuals are working. So should we be using the resources that we can take from expanding healthcare to monitor people's work? I mean, we can do that, and if there are people that are trying to game the system, if you will, which there are not that many in reality, then that's something that we can deal with. But the simpler that we can do this, the better.
Yeah. So let me come back to something the governor mentioned before, John, this idea that we shouldn't just focus on four-year degrees, right? Which is something I know you believe as well. And you also alluded to this when you talked about the funding divide. People think of the funding divide K-12, right? The rich suburban districts versus the struggling rural or urban districts. But actually it extends to higher ed as well. And one thing that worries me a little bit is one of the few things that you hear politicians of both parties talk about in very similar terms is community college, right? Actually, if you listen to people from the Trump administration and people from the Obama administration, even if the policies aren't the same, the words often are. But when you look at the results for community colleges, they're often really, really poor. Graduation rates that are sometimes below 20%, earnings results that don't look quite nearly as good as many four-year schools. And I know some of that comes from the funding shortfall. It seems to me it's probably not all the funding shortfall. There are also some performance issues there. Can you talk about, as we're talking about skills here, community colleges are such a vital part of it, how can we have a better functioning community college sector?
Yeah. Oh, I worry a lot about this. You can go places around the country. You're right, where the graduation rate is in the teens, right? A 6-year graduation rate in the teens for community college. I have a few things going on. One is states have been systematically disinvesting from public higher education for multiple decades. And it's worth noting that a lot of those dollars have been put into incarceration, which is, terrible. I'm not an economist, but seems like a terrible economic strategy, right? To invest in prisons rather than higher education. So there is a need to invest in community colleges to make sure that quality programming is available there. That's for sure true. But you're right, there are performance issues, and we know that there are places that are addressing that. So I think about City University of New York. They have a program called CUNY ASAP. It's wraparound supports, better academic advising, access to tutoring. You get a Metro card, which is like gold if you live in New York City, but you only get the Metro card if you show up for your advising. They have pathways programs, so you are taking a set of courses that are going to lead to a job. In the CUNY ASAP program, they've doubled the completion rate in community college in a randomized controlled trial for students who are required to take a remedial course upon entering community college. We ought to be scaling up programs like CUNY ASAP all across the country. Now, MDRC is doing the study on CUNY ASAP. They actually are replicating it in Ohio with gas cards rather than a Metro card, but same idea. And they're seeing similar outcomes. So we ought to invest in that. I think if the Higher Education Act is reauthorized, or when it is reauthorized, we ought to include a big investment in innovation in community colleges to improve those outcomes. Last point is we've really got to do a better job connecting community colleges with employers, right? And making sure that there's a meaningful pathway there so that when you graduate, you know there's a job. And it's for two reasons. One is we'll get a better return on the investment in community college. The other is for the folks who are in community college, so powerful to know that there's something good on the other end, not just more uncertainty. And so we could be doing a much better. I know I said that was the last point, but one more point.
No, keep going.
There's a recent study that showed across 2- and 4-year colleges that we may have as many as a quarter of students, a third of students who are food insecure. And one of the challenges we have to take on is that the community college student, they may be able to use their Pell Grant to cover tuition. They may be able to use their state aid to cover tuition. But then they got to live. They got to pay for housing. They got to pay for food. They got to pay for books. And so we ought to be investing much more, certainly in the Pell Grant program, but in providing the supports that students need. It's hard. Look, there's somebody in here who didn't have lunch today. You're probably having a hard time concentrating. Imagine going to class every day not knowing where your next meal is coming from. Right? That's no way that's going to be an easy path to graduation. We should be doing much better on that front.
The national statistics show, to that point, the average tuition at community college, net tuition, when you include financial aid, as you well know, is less than zero. But costs are still a huge problem at community colleges because you got to pay for your lodging, you got to pay for your food, you got to pay for your books, all those things. Can you talk a little bit about the income-based repayment?
Yeah, so I think that also goes to the issue of accountability, whether it's a community college or a 4-year college or university, a for-profit or not-profit. I think the idea is that instead of a fixed borrowing money, that the school agrees to fund some portion of the cost of attendance themselves in return for a contract where then the student, once they graduate, pays back a certain percentage up to a cap over a certain period of time. And I would love to see the federal program fund a pilot, sharing maybe 50-50, the federal government and the school, because what this does is it aligns economic incentives. So it actually invests the school in making sure the student gets a good education, graduates, and gets a job, and then they will share in the risk and the reward of that education if successful. So it aligns economic incentives in a way that you really don't have now. So one of the reasons, many reasons why I really don't like student debt to fund undergraduate education, it puts it all on the student, and it puts it all on the taxpayer if the student doesn't pay. So the schools, where the tuition dollars are going, aren't really held accountable for any of those costs. But I think this is an elegant way to have them share in the risk and the rewards of a good education that can be applied across, whether it's a community college, a 4-year university, what have you. So I do think a few brave colleges have tried to pilot it on their own. Unfortunately, we're not seeing much traction in the higher ed reauthorization this year. Hopefully, we can get some attention to it. But I do think it's a nice, elegant way to align economic incentives and simple and gets us away from this debt model, which is such a huge burden. I mean, so the payment that the student owes once they graduate varies based on their income. And they actually have done this in Australia for some time, and it has, excuse the economic jargon, but it has nice macroeconomic benefits too, because if you get into recession and people lose their jobs, debt's very inflexible. Lose your job, can't pay back the debt, you're defaulting. Income share just automatically adjusts, and then when the economy comes back, the payments go back up. So it doesn't have exacerbate a recessionary trend, which is what we saw in 2008 with so many people with large mortgage debt they couldn't afford, and then they just stopped consumer spending because they were trying to pay back their mortgage debt. With ISAs, it automatically fluctuates. So there are a lot of benefits both for the school, the student, and the broader economy.
I was just going to say, I think another way that we can help our community colleges is to use innovation and what I refer to as a dashboard concept, where businesses actually list the jobs that they have available so that our education systems can see what jobs they need to train individuals for. And also individuals can look and see, well, these are some jobs that are available out there. So again, it's all about, I think, opening up that pipeline from our youth to workforce development. And I think if we use innovation and do that through, again, what I would call a dashboard system, that we can help a lot of folks and really help promote our community colleges. And people will be aware of the jobs that are available. And just one quick example that I hear in Virginia as I go around, and I don't hear the business world talk about it that much, is the hospitality industry. We have hotels, we have restaurants, and people the employers can rarely find the people that are able to work in those areas. So again, if you have a system that lets the education system know that with some urgency, we need to train individuals for the hospitality industry, then we can help put a lot of people to work and help businesses.
That's a nice example, because my impression is that one of the reasons why workforce retraining has sometimes fallen short of people's expectations is that the skills of the workers and the needs of the jobs are different, right? The workers have skills, but it isn't necessarily the skills to be, say, a healthcare technician, which is where the needs are, whereas hospitality is a fairly broad-based skill. Okay, I want to open it up to all of you. So I think we're going to have some microphones circulating. That's the rumor. Wonderful. We have one here. So raise your hand. I'll call on you. We'll get you a microphone. Please just tell us who you are and let us know your question.
Thank you. So my name is Claudia, George Washington University. So we live in a world where the public-private partnerships are increasing. We have LinkedIn here trying to do something for the public. Maybe connecting community colleges with LinkedIn's and jobs and supply demand. Do you think that's possible? One question. And two, how about the Pay for Success initiative? Do you think that could be an opportunity for schools and companies as well?
Who wants to go?
Tackle that one. Hey, you're it.
I just want to make sure, everyone else may know it. Are you referring to a particular Pay for Success initiative or the broad idea of instead of funding folks, basically the social impact bond type stuff where groups get money only if they get results or they get more money? Right.
Well, I think let me go back to ISAs for a minute, because I think ISAs are kind of a version of that, where the school is funding the ISA, or at least partially funding the ISA. That is a payment for success, because if they've done their job of graduating the student, and making sure that that student is gainfully employed, then that is the reward. So I think that is one advantage. I think I celebrate the better focus on outcomes in occupational training in particular, but just as a former liberal arts college, I feel like I need to get my hand up just a second on that, not pigeonholing people and making sure that as we focus on this, that we still continue to provide the rich variety of educational options that are available, because liberal arts it started with the Greeks, and actually the liberal arts would only let the elite get a liberal arts education because it taught you how to think and communicate, and they thought, well, you need to do that to be a free person, but so the masses were kind of pigeonholed into narrow occupational fields. And so I just think it's a danger in being too narrow in terms of educational opportunities or how we think about what, making judgments for students about what's right for them. And an occupational degree is great. And being cognizant, schools should be cognizant of labor force needs and educating and counseling their students on that, but also not to too much undervalue these, and I heard Anne-Marie Slaughter talking about this earlier, a classic liberal arts education, thinking kids how to think, to write, to analyze, to communicate, to adapt. Those are skills that will serve them a lifetime, whereas an occupational course of training may be very helpful, but in a few years you might have to go back because it will become outdated.
John, I'd be interested in your view on, particularly in the educational realm. Indiana, Florida, I'm sure you know the whole list. A bunch of states have essentially said to colleges, we're going to fund you in part based on your graduation rate. Yeah. Is that working well?
Yeah. So the worry there is that this notion of risk sharing of performance-based funding is very attractive because it helps to shift the incentives. But if you do it in a way that doesn't account for what I might call the difficulty of the dive, you end up exacerbating equity problems. So if you reward colleges just based on whether or not students finish, the schools that take the affluent students, the schools that are more selective, will win that race every time. Right? So what you want to do is say to colleges, well, we're going to reward you for taking more vulnerable students and helping them to finish. And so you can envision a design of a performance-based funding system that might push some of the flagship universities to take more first-generation students, more low-income students, and reward them. But also that would incentivize community colleges, some of the 4 years that don't have as strong graduation rates, to invest in better supports for students so that they graduate. But I worry that many of the states, they like the performance part, but they haven't figured out how to do it in a way that advances equity. Another thing I just mentioned quickly on the pay for success idea, we did a fair amount of experimentation with pay for success ideas in the administration and embarked on some partnerships. The thing I worry about is once we have the gold standard evidence that something works, we still need the political will to scale it. Take, for instance, educational programs for folks who are incarcerated. We've got decades of evidence that if you get educational programs while incarcerated, you are much less likely to return to prison. Right? Any educational program is 43% reduction in your likelihood of returning to prison, and yet we are unwilling to scale it. In many places, folks who are incarcerated are not getting any new skills, and then, of course, when they get out, they end up very quickly back in prison. We had a pilot project to allow folks who are incarcerated to have access to Pell Grants. If you use those Pell Grants to get your education, you leave prison with a college degree or largely towards a college degree. It's going to be better for you. It's going to be better for your kids. At this point, we have the evidence. We need the will to scale.
Mike coming back. Oh, sorry. I thought that was a hand. Oh, yeah, there is. Great. We'll go here and then back there.
First of all, thank you all for being here today and speaking to us regarding education access and how it translates over to economic and bigger opportunities. My name is Angel, and I'm with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. One of the things that I wanted to ask, touching on a point that you had just made, is the idea of political willpower and translating that when it comes to evidence. So I think one of the biggest examples of that has been, one of the biggest examples of the divide between the evidence and the data and the understanding or political will was the sessions when they had with Mark Zuckerberg when he spoke, and he basically was telling them how the internet works. So my question is, how does one translate data to advise policy that addresses institutional barriers to job access and professional development?
One of the things that I would just emphasize is that, I hear the word political will, and I think a lot of our leaders have vision for what we think is the right thing to do, but the next step is how to make that happen at the political level, at the legislative level. In my case, we just talked about expanding Medicaid, which to me seems like a no-brainer, if you will, but I have 100 delegates and 40 senators, and to get them all on the same sheet of music sometimes can be very difficult. So in other words, it is difficult having the leverage that you need as a leader sometimes to do what you know by following data. And I am a scientist. My background is in healthcare. So we feel like we know what we need to do. So where we need your help is on election day. And we need to make sure that we vet those individuals that are running for office and know what they stand for. And if they don't fall into line with our beliefs, then we need to find someone else who does. So there's a great movement, I believe, across this country now with our youth. I think our youth, our millennials, we want to be progressive. They want to be innovative. They want to be inclusive. And we need to find leaders that follow those same, that same direction. So that's where you come in, and that is giving us folks that we can work with to take some of this data and turn it into good policy.
This year will be a really interesting test, right? The
Yes.
voter turnout for 18 to 24-year-olds in our last midterm election was below 20%, right? Which reminds me of the old story, I don't know if it's apocryphal, about FDR, where a political leader came to him and said, you need to do this. And he said, you need to make me do this.
There you go. That's exactly right.
So we got one here and one back there, and we'll try to squeeze them both in. Please keep them quick.
Wait, David, really, really quickly, we
Yes.
also just have a special guest. We were joined by Congressman Ro Khanna from the 17th District of California, and LinkedIn is actually in Congressman Khanna's district in Sunnyvale. So we wanted to turn it over to Congressman Khanna very quickly for a couple of remarks on career pathways, skills, upskilling, and workforce development.
Well, I'll be very brief because you got such a distinguished panel, and I was as elated when Governor Northam won as probably every Democrat in this country, and you've got a great panel. I'm honored to represent the district that has LinkedIn, Apple, Google, a lot of Silicon Valley. Let me be brief. I'm actually headed to West Virginia on Monday at the invitation of President Gordon G. And Gordon is the president of West Virginia University, and he's expanding West Virginia University from Morgantown to Beckley. And he came out to Silicon Valley to get some support for his enterprise in Beckley. And there are two things that struck me with that. One, Gordon G. said, the worst message that you can possibly have to folks in communities is go move. Go move to where the jobs are. I ask people in Silicon Valley all the time, do you want to move to where I grew up, to Bucks County, Pennsylvania? They say no. And if you ask my parents who are still in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, do they want to move to Silicon Valley? They'll tell you no. And I know there are a lot of economists, Rod Chetty, others who say go move, but we have to respect that people love their communities. They love their families there, they love their parents there, and I think the challenge is how do we get the jobs and economic opportunities to them? When Gordon G. tells the story, he says that people in Beckley think going to Morgantown is like going to a communist campus. They don't even want to go to Morgantown, let alone go to Silicon Valley. So my emphasis has been how do we get Silicon Valley to partner with communities and build that. And it's been very successful. The final point I'll make, when I just got elected, Hal Rogers, he's a Republican, he represents Paintsville you can't have a different district than our district where LinkedIn is. My district is 50% foreign born. Hal Rogers' district, 99% born in the United States. My district, about 50% Asian American. Hal Rogers' district, 99% Caucasian. I went there and I said, what are they going to think of me? And they said, all right, here's this Indian American guy. Maybe he's going to bring a lot of tech jobs. But you had coal miners' kids learning about tech, proud of the coal industry, but understanding that the economy is changing and they want diversification. When I went there, people said, oh, you're going to talk about innovation? Of course we need to talk about innovation. It's insulting, in my view, to folks to think they don't get it. Of course they get the economy is changing, and they want to make sure they're not left out and they have pathways. And I think we have a great opportunity to provide those. So thank you for letting me share a few words. You've got an outstanding panel here.
Thank you, Congressman. So I'm looking for some stage direction here. Can we fit in two last quick questions? Yes, here we go. One in the front and one right back there. I won't forget, I promise. Yeah, right here.
Hi, thank you. Building on the Congressman's points about reskilling and pathways, my name is Lisa Newberger. I'm with Accenture, and we're investing in innovation to support low and middle skill workers transitioning to new jobs in the digital economy. And you all have different perspectives here. I'm interested in how you frame the solution side, where you would like to see investments to solve these.
I'll just be very quick with my response, and it all starts with access to education, and in rural Virginia especially, in 2018, we have so many pockets that don't have access to broadband, and if I could get some help and take care of that and make sure that, in my case, all of Virginia has that access, it would be a big step in the right direction. Because if you think about a business that wants to grow or attracting a new business or educating our children, if you don't have access to broadband in this day and age, then you really have your hands tied. So that's one of the things. If we want to lift up all of the country, including rural areas, that has to be the next step.
it's particularly important because in a place like Washington, we take for granted access to higher education, but there are large parts of your state and most of this country where you are a couple hours away from any kind of higher education. Sir, in the back.
Good afternoon. My name is Saif Ishouf. I'm with Florida International University. We're America's largest Hispanic serving institution. And my question is really focused on the concern for the panelists and most notably the governor and former Secretary King on this false choice which is being presented in certain discussions about four-year degrees versus competency-based education and the extent to which there are lingering questions around social mobility for some of the competency-based platforms. Clearly, there's the need for innovation and adaptation in higher ed, but in certain business circles, when we're out there, higher ed leaders are told by stakeholders we need the end of the college degree, but yet oftentimes those are folks that are white, affluent leaders. When you ask them where did their own children go, it's to selective institutions. So I'm curious to hear this end of the degree versus the morphing and the perspectives of the panel around that. Thank you very much.
Well, a couple quick observations. One is that there's a lot of talk about certificates, but if you look at the data on default rates, the default rate for people who get a certificate is about the same, 1 percentage point different from the default rate for people who drop out. So we don't have evidence yet that certificates are the answer, even though people talk like they are. Now, there may be particular types of certificates matched with particular employers that do create mobility for folks. One of the things we would need to better understand that is a better data system for higher education generally. It's why student unit record matters. We ought to be able to track every student and look at the outcomes for them, not just in terms of completion, but their long-term employment outcomes, so that we can shift the incentives to reward programs that not only graduate students, but graduate them into good jobs that allow them to pay back their debt. So that's one. Two is I think we've got to help shift this kind of anti-education public narrative that is developing by doing a better job telling the story of how education is the engine of mobility, right? Education is going to drive probably $1 million more in lifetime earnings if you earn a bachelor's degree. In many parts of the country, one person in the family getting a college degree can change the outcomes for multiple generations. So we've got to tell that story better. The last point I would make is that I do think higher ed has to hear people's anxiety about the misalignment at times between what's happening in higher ed and what employers are looking for, and can't just close their ears to that. And so there has to be a willingness for faculty members to sit down with employers to sort out what is the right skill match. When the governor referenced this, one example of this is the PTEC school in New York City, where IBM, City University of New York, New York City DOE sat down together and said, what would it look like to have students graduate from high school with a diploma, an associate's degree, first in line for a job at IBM? And that's now being replicated in places all over New York State with different employers. And the real genius to it is getting everyone around the table to talk about what are the skills that students need, and then what are the experiences, the internship experiences, the mentoring experiences that will ultimately lead to productive employment.
You want the last word, Sheila?
Governor? Oh. No, well, look, I think it's the leadership this group is showing of connecting education to upward mobility, correcting the terrible numbers that you put on the chart earlier on, I think we need to have more of this kind of discussion. And the earlier question about where people can invest, John's earlier comments about, I found at Washington College increasingly that students were not prepared for college, or emotionally they needed more support. So I think having the support services to help those kids graduate is important as well, and sometimes overlooked. But it is, with some of them, it's an intensive effort to help them through, but it is so worth it if they make it. So.
Governor, in your first few months on the job, what have been the biggest reason for optimism about our future?
Youth and the involvement now in politics. And, as probably people know, I'm a physician. I've made a lot of good grades to get there, but I do have an F with the NRA. And so, thank you. And so, tragedy after tragedy, and finally, what I've seen after the Parkland tragedy, when youth are getting involved and telling us as leaders what we need to do, and that movement is not going away. So I'm really encouraged by the energy and enthusiasm, and again, we need to keep electing leaders that have vision and that want to take this country in the right direction.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, our esteemed panelists. I just wanted to call out a couple of individuals in the room before we close. We are focused on getting you out on time, but can our LinkedIn Economic Graph team just raise your hands, please? And then also, for those of you who have questions, these guys will be hanging around, and you can absolutely just pull them aside, whether it's Guy or Jackie on the economist side, Ephraim and Nate on NOB and NASWA, Paul and Brian and Alan on analytics. Our entire team is here, led by Pablo Chavez, who's our VP of Global Public Policy. LaRon Johnson, who's the head of our Detroit office, is also here for those of you who have questions. All questions about Detroit, ask LaRon. And then Nick DePorter, who leads our National League of Cities and other national partnerships. With that, I just also want to thank Hannah and Tony Vu, who's not here, unfortunately, but really grateful for everyone who attended and for all of your comments, feedback, recommendations. Please connect with us on LinkedIn. It's your #1 goal. And also follow our Economic Graph page. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me directly or Pablo or anyone on our team. Thank you.